Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about Frost Mage in the Midnight Prepatch. We're going to be going over Frost Mage's new identity, the talents I've been running both in Raid and Mythic Plus, as well as the basic rotations for each so you actually know what buttons to press and why you're hitting them. But before we start, there's a quick disclaimer here. This is Prepatch. Balance is weird, tuning is all over the place, and there are definitely some things that feel a bit unintended, so I'm not sitting here pretending that this is the final solved version of Frost Mage. Everything in this video is based entirely on what I've personally had success with during the prepatch. The goal here is to give you a simple, practical foundation you can play without having to overthink it, whether you're jumping into Raid, Mythic Plus, or just trying to figure out why your Icelands hasn't been pressed in 5 minutes, which, spoiler alert, might actually be a thing. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about Frost Mage's new identity, because that's where most of the confusion here comes from. The general idea of Frost Mage is you're building freezing stacks on the target and then consuming them with shatter windows with casts like Icelands or Comet Storm. At least that seems to be the intent. Because in actual gameplay, especially in Mythic Plus, it's not always what ends up happening. With the current M Plus build I've been running, a lot of the damage is actually centered around Comet Storm triggering Shatter interactions and then just riding the damage out rather than managing your Shatter or Icelands procs. In practice, Icelands ends up being way less important than you might expect in Mythic Plus specifically. Outside of a few specific scenarios, you're not really thinking about your freezing stacks or setting up the perfect shatter windows at all. You're mostly just playing around your big AoE button, and the shatter value just kind of happens in the background. Now, we'll get into why that works later when we talk about the rotation, but at an identity level, this is where Frost feels a little strange in the prepatch. This may or may not be intended, but if I had to guess, it's very much not intended, so keep that in mind going into Midnight. But let's go ahead and jump on into the talent, starting off with single target. This is the version of Frost where Icelands actually matters, mainly because Spellslinger gives Icelands extra value that Frostfire just doesn't get. Between Icelands generating extra shatter value, as well as conjuring more splinters through Spellslinger, you're actually being rewarded for pressing it in a way that outweighs anything Frostfire can do for you in single target. So instead of Icelands feeling like a filler button you press because it's glowing, it becomes something that you actively hit because it's being fed into by the rest of your kit. The real interaction you need to understand here is how Flurry, Icelands, and Frostbolt all feed into each other. It starts with the talent Brain Freeze, where Frostbolt or Frostfirebolt both have a chance to reset Flurry and make that Flurry hit harder. On their own, both of these spells do decent damage, but that's not really the point. Every Frostbolt you cast is basically just fishing for a new Brain Freeze proc. When those procs happen, you're not just getting additional damage, but generating more freezing stacks through additional Flurry casts, which creates more opportunities for shatter windows. And on top of that, we have the talent Thermal Void. When you consume a Brain Freeze proc, your next Icelands will consume additional freezing stacks. More flurries means more freezing stacks, means more shatter windows, means more damage. That's the core loop of single target Frost with Spellslinger. You're constantly feeding back into yourself, setting up a shatter window, spending it, and then immediately creating your next opportunity, building it back up. Now for Mythic Plus, this is where things really change, because with this build, we're basically completely foregoing Icelands. Instead of carefully managing shatter or trying to spend freezing stacks efficiently, the setup is much more relaxed. You're letting freezing stacks climb, you don't really worry about overcapping them, and you're playing towards this big AoE payoff moment rather than a lot of smaller shatter windows. You still care about Brain Freeze procs, and you're still casting Flurry because Flurry and Frostfirebolt do decent damage on their own, but you're not using them to set up Icelands chains. Most of the time, you're just letting that freezing value sit there while you keep your AoE rolling. The important thing to understand in the Mythic Plus setup that it's not built around a bunch of talents feeding into each other like single target, but rather talents that are just better suited for AoE, and that really dictates the style of play here. And really, one talent specifically is what this entire thing is built around, being Comet Storm. This is really the only talent that changes your gameplay. After you cast Ray of Frost, it turns into Comet Storm, which drops a series of comets that deal heavy AoE damage and shatter freezing stacks for every comet that hits. Because of that, the entire M Plus rotation naturally drifts towards letting freezing stacks build up and then dumping everything when Comet Storm becomes available. Aside from that talent, we do swap out Frigid Focus for Splintering Ray for some extra AoE on a Ray of Frost, but the only other talent really worth mentioning here is Freezing Rain. This increases our Blizzard's damage and makes our next Blizzard instant cast after we use Frozen Orb, which just kind of smooths out the AoE rotation a bit. But that's really all there is for important talent callouts. If you want to just simply import the builds I have here, I have linked both the single target and Mythic Plus builds in the description below in a Google Sheet that you can just pull if you want. But with that out of the way, let's get into the meat and potatoes with the rotations. Starting off with single target, like we talked about in the last section, the core of this setup is generating Brain Freeze procs with Frostbolt, and then converting those procs into value through Thermal Void. But the rotation really falls into this simplistic nature, being first up your cooldowns. Simply put, when they are available, you use them. Frozen Orb and Ray of Frost don't have any fancy setup required in single target, and they're really just sent on CD. Once cooldowns are out of the way, Ice Lance becomes your main spender, but only when it's actually worth pressing. With Thermal Void, you want to be using Ice Lance when you build up enough stacks to get real value out of it, and as a general rule of thumb, you want Ice Lance to be around 12 stacks before you're clicking it, or anytime you have Fingers of Frost. Really, 12 stacks means hit Ice Lance. After that, we have Glacial Spike, and just like our cooldowns, when it's available, you just hit it. Simple as that. The other half of our time here, when we're not in our Shatter windows, will be setting up those Shatter windows, which is where Flurry comes into play. You're reacting to Brain Freeze procs and using Flurry primarily as a setup tool for your Ice Lance, with every proc also triggering Thermal Void, allowing you to send more empowered Ice Lances. After that, we're just sending Flurries to generate more freezing stacks, and whenever none of those other options are available, we're casting Frostbolt. While Frostbolt does deal decent damage, its primary focus isn't that, but rather to fish for Brain Freeze procs. So if you zoom out, the rotation is actually pretty simplistic. You use your cooldowns when they're up, you use your Ice Lance with Thermal Void at 12 stacks or with Fingers of Frost, you then Glacial Spike, Flurry, and Frostbolt. If you're ever unsure about what to press, the answer is usually Frostbolt. More Frostbolts means more Brain Freeze procs, and more procs means more Shatter windows, and that's where all of your damage really comes from. But really, the entire spec in single target just kind of boils down to one simple question. Does the target have 12 stacks of freezing? If yes, hit Ice Lance. If no, hit Flurry. If Flurry isn't available, you hit Frostbolt. That's it. Ice Lance is your big payoff button, Flurry is your setup tool, and Frostbolt is what keeps the entire engine running. As long as you're following that flow, while there's always going to be room for optimization, you're playing the spec correctly enough to deal at least decent amounts of damage. Now, Mythic Plus looks a bit different to our single target rotation. It's still the priority-based rotation we're used to, but it's really important to understand here that your opener matters a lot more when you're going into a pull with your cooldowns available. The goal of the opener is to build up a solid amount of freezing stacks first so that your Comet Storm shatters as many stacks as possible all at once for a huge burst damage. First off, as your tank starts collecting adds, you want to cast Flurry, and if possible, Flurry again to quickly build those freezing stacks. After that, we cast Frozen Orb, which is done intentionally before Comet Storm because of the talent Permafrost Lances. This increases shatter damage by 10%, and you want that buff active before you detonate anything. Once that's out, I like to send out my instant cast Blizzard and follow it up with a Ray of Frost Comet Storm. That sequence sets up a strong amount of freezing stacks and lets Comet Storm shatter a huge number of them at once, which is where the build's entire burst damage comes from. But one important thing to keep in mind here with this opener is that there is some nuance depending upon what your tank is doing. If your tank is still gathering mobs, you generally want to hold it until he's finished gathering to maximize your damage. In those situations, it's completely fine to delay Comet Storm and keep building freezing stacks instead. You can continue sending Flurry when you get Brain Freeze procs, or just casting Frostfire Bolt and stacking more freezing while the tank finishes grouping everything up. Then once the pack is planted, you drop a Comet Storm and cash in on everything for a big dopamine hit of massive AoE damage. Don't feel locked into pressing it the instant Comet Storm becomes available. The opener gives you structure that you're following, but the overall dungeon flow is always what comes first. While the majority of your damage is going to come from setting up that opener properly, the priority damage outside of that is much more simplistic. When your cooldowns are available, send them. That means Ray of Frost, Frozen Orb, and Comet Storm, with one important condition being you want to cast Comet Storm when the target has 16 stacks of freezing, so you're actually shattering the right number of freezing stacks. After that, we have Glacial Spike, then Flurry, then Blizzard, and finally Frostfire Bolt when none of those are available. Now, the astute of you might realize the distinct lack of Ice Lance here, and no, you're not misremembering, and no, you're not mishearing. I did not mention it, because we currently do not hit Ice Lance in this build. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, this is likely to change, but as for now, this is what we're looking at. Hey, this is Mac from the future, watching this back as I'm editing and realizing that I should probably call out that we don't hit Ice Lance in our typical rotation, however we can use it to fill in movement. While casts like Comet Storm and Flurry are instant casts and can get us through a lot of movement, sometimes we don't have those available. So if there is any movement and we don't have any of those other things available to us, we should be using Ice Lance to fill those globals so we're not missing any uptime on extra damage. But that's it. Use Ice Lance if you are moving, and this has been an extra special pause with Mac. Thanks. But that's Frost Mage and Prepatch. Things are weird, and some things are almost definitely not how Frost is going to look once Midnight launches, but for now, this is what actually works. Like I mentioned earlier, both of my single target and Mythic Plus talent import codes are linked in the description in a Google Sheet alongside my UI, so if anything here interests you, you can feel free to go set that up and jump into Frost Mage super quick. And if this guide helped you out, make sure to drop a like, subscribe for more Warcraft content, and let me know in the comments below what you're playing or what's felt good for you in the pre-patch so far. I might be looking for a new main. And that's all I have for today, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.